Hey guys, my name is Bianca. I'm from Vintage on Tap, and in this video I'm actually going to be showing you guys how I trace my sewing patterns before every single project. So I'm going to be showing you guys how I trace off my PDF patterns, how I trace off my paper patterns, as well as vintage patterns with perforations, which a lot of people don't know how to do. So hang tight and I'll show you guys how I take care of this. Cool, so to get started, you're gonna need a few different materials. A lot of you guys will already have this in your stash of sewing stuff, but a lot of this might be new as well. So the first things first, I have a ruler. I prefer the clear ones just because they do have the individual markings in there. Then we have a French ruler or French curve. This one's super handy. It's a little bit more pricey, but you're gonna use it a lot, so you should have this anyway. Now I got my mechanical pencil and eraser. I've got these pattern weights. These ones are from Rach Against the Machine. You can order these from her if you'd like. I love these ones, these are great. Scissors, and then the most important part, the paper. So the paper's a little tricky just because it's up to everyone's preference. I've heard a lot of different types of papers that people like to use online. So I'll go over some of the common ones that people talk about. The first one is tracing paper or butcher paper. Tracing paper and actually sketch paper as well will work. This is one from a notebook. You can tape multiple pieces together if you don't have access to big sheets of paper. You just want to make sure that the paper is as see-through as possible, just because you need to be able to see the pattern pieces that you're tracing off of it. So this one's pretty common. If I ran out of any other type of paper, this is like my extra go-to. Second one I've heard people use a lot of is wrapping paper. I have this Santa Claus one from a while ago. I don't like to use Santa paper, but again, if you don't have anything else on hand, this is useful. What sucks about this one specifically though is that you're not really going to see through this, so it's going to make tracing a little bit more challenging. And also this one's harder to press because you will need to be able to press this with a iron, so just in case you don't have anything. Now my preferred paper that I like to use and I use on all my projects is dot paper, which I actually learned about when I started going to college. This stuff is amazing. It's really cheap. Don't cheap out, get this stuff. This stuff is amazing. Have your grid on there, so it's easy to use. As I said, it's pretty cheap. It might be a little bit tricky to find if you don't have access to any sort of fabric store that's a little bit more geared towards garment sewing. Your Joann's may or may not have it, probably not. I've never seen it there. This one in particular, where I am in San Francisco, I buy this from the art supply store, which helps with a lot of the sewing classes here in the Bay Area, so I'm able to pick it up pretty cheaply. I think the last time I bought it, I bought 5 yards of this paper. I think it cost me $6, so it's relatively inexpensive. And the nice thing about this is that you're not clinging to it as much as you might some of the other stuff. This stuff I can tear up, I can throw in the trash can. I have no problems getting rid of this or adjusting this. So these are the materials. Once you got everything set up, we're gonna go to the next step, which is on the iron. The next most important thing besides the paper is gonna be your iron, which you wanna make sure is free of water. So what I like to do just to make sure is I dump the water out in the sink from the reservoir, and then I'll turn it up to the highest setting and then just use the steam button and make sure to keep steaming until there's no more steam coming out of it. And at that point, you're good to go. So once you have gotten all the water out of it, I want to go ahead and lower the temperature on the iron and obviously wait for it to cool down just enough so you can start using it. I've put mine down to the synthetic, but you could probably use a silk one as well. But you want to make sure to use the lowest setting just so you don't ruin any of the paper you're about to start using. So the first pattern we're going to trace off is a PDF pattern, which I've already taped together. So the first thing you want to do is lay out your pattern paper, and you're going to be placing this guy on top of the pattern paper. From here, I'm just going to eyeball it and kind of just make sure that I don't waste paper if I don't need to. So I'm going to go ahead and cut along the pattern piece. I'm going to not just cut out the one little piece. I'm just going to go ahead and cut the whole strip. That way it'll make the paper easier to put away. Cool. So at this point, we're done with this guy for now. And next, we're going to press this guy with the iron because you can kind of see it starting to roll up. So we have our unruly paper. So I'm going to go ahead and try and get it flat because it'll be a little less difficult to work with. So it's just going to be a quick press all the way down just to flatten it out. Now, the thing with PDF patterns is that a lot of people think it's totally cool to just cut into them, and to be honest, that's fine if you want to do that. It's not a big deal. I personally don't like to cut into my PDF patterns because of how much paper it took to print them out, how much tape it took to put them together, and just generally just kind of how I don't want to have to print it all out and start from scratch. So I trace everything. All right, so I've done one press through. I'm going to go ahead and do it the opposite way just in case. So, I mean, there's also the concerns that people have about PDF patterns. You know, a lot of slightly older generations think it's a waste of time to tape them all together. I mean, it can be time consuming, but as long as you do it that once, you're good to go. You don't have to cut into it and then have to spend that time again. Once you've taped it all together, you're good to go. So cool, this looks pretty good. So we're gonna go ahead and start tracing. Cool, so to get started, I'm gonna go ahead and place this pattern piece underneath my tracing paper. And then from there, I'm gonna go ahead and smooth it all out, make sure everything is as flat as possible. You can see that the tracing paper isn't curling at all anymore, which is gonna make this all so much easier. So from here, I'm gonna go ahead and put in my pattern weights, which I love these button pattern weights. They're so useful. Cool. So once that's on there, I'm gonna go ahead and get started tracing. Now, you can trace just kind of freehand. I just don't recommend it. Might as well just do it right the first time and be done with it. So I've got my straight edge, and I'm gonna go ahead and just go ahead and start tracing. And the good thing about, as I said, this tracing paper earlier, is that I can see through it, which makes everything so much easier. So I'm gonna go ahead and switch over to my curve ruler. Now, because I'm doing medium size, I already know which line to go and work through. If it is a little bit difficult for you to see through the paper, I might recommend coloring the line on the original pattern piece, and that way you can see it through whatever paper you end up deciding to use. Cool, so here we have the original and we have our tracing. So you always want to make sure that you get your notches in if you didn't already, and you get your grain lines. So I'm gonna go ahead and just generally cut this out. When I'm working on a big piece, I just cut out the general shapes of it until I'm ready to start working, because I'm not going to spend time cutting out the individual pattern piece. It's not efficient. So I've gone ahead and cut that out. Then at this point, I have a Prismacolor marker that I use to write on my pattern pieces. I also have a highlighter just in case I need to differentiate like a front piece versus a back piece. Technically the back piece will say back on there, but I like being able to see it at a glance. Okay, everything with the yellow, with the highlighter is going to be the back pieces, so I can grab one really fast. So I'm gonna go ahead and just go ahead and copy from this piece onto this piece the pattern information. So, and we got sleeve, and so it says cut one pair. I'm just going to put cut two self, because that's the language that I like to use. I know everyone writes it a little bit different, but that's how I make sense of it. And this is going to be size medium. Cool. So at that point, you're good to go to move on to the next piece after tracing off a PDF. So now we're going to trace off a paper pattern that you can find in most fabric stores. This is going to be for an upcoming project, so I actually have to kind of get started tracing this already. So anyway, so the first thing I do is I pull up a piece of scrap paper and I go to my instructions before I even get started. So first thing I do is look at the line drawing, and I kind of take notice of what pattern pieces I need, and I actually write them all down on a scrap paper. Now, because this particular pattern does not have any variations, I know I'm going to need every piece listed here, but if you knew you need piece A, piece C, piece D, or whatever, I would just write them down so that as I trace them off, I'm crossing off the list, so I make sure that I don't miss anything. But once you have that taken care of, the next thing you got to do is take care of this guy, which is a pain in the neck. I know, especially when they're folded up so beautifully in the envelope and then you cannot get them back in the envelope. That's such a pain. So I know I'm going to need all of it, so I'm just going to go ahead and pick a piece here for this tutorial, but I will be doing this step through every single piece that was in this envelope. So as you can see, I have one of these big pattern sheets, so I'm just going to go ahead and press the entire thing to get all these wrinkles out so it's easier to trace. Now, same thing as with the PDF pattern, low setting, and just go for it. Cool. So you can kind of see the mess that a lot of these commercial patterns can make. So as I said, just make sure that you have them written down while you're working on them, because it can be super confusing to go through all of those. All right, so I'm going to lay out the pattern on top of a scrap just because I'm going to be tracing a small piece for this tutorial. Now, you can cut out the pattern piece from this main paper and then put it on there. I prefer not to do that. As I said, I prefer to just keep everything where it is so I don't lose anything. If I cut out the pocket and it goes flying somewhere, I'm going to be without a pocket for this pattern. And so it's actually also, for me anyway, good practice, especially if you're working with like Japanese sewing patterns. Japanese sewing patterns, or books like Gertie's Book for Better Sewing, things like that, have multiple pattern pieces laid on top of each other, so you're not going to be able to just cut them out. In that case, obviously trace them out like we do with these guys, or use graphite to trace them out that way, like graphite sheets. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and trace this out the same way that we did the previous one, by laying the pattern paper on top and then putting our pattern weights on top of that, and then getting to work with the ruler. So at this point, I've already traced off from my commercial pattern, so I'm going to go ahead and write the same information that I need as I did on the PDF one. You know, I just kind of want to say that I know there's a lot of people who don't like tracing off commercial patterns because they think it's too easy. I'll just go ahead and buy a new pattern, blah, blah, blah. And to be honest, I don't really subscribe to that way of thinking, just because I think it's really wasteful. You know, besides, I also don't have the time to be going down to Joann's or ordering online and waiting X amount of days when I already have the pattern. You know, there's no need for me to keep rebuying and spending money buying new patterns just because I cut into it and I was too lazy to trace it. I know a lot of people think differently than me about that, but I mean, I might want to sell this later. This pattern might go out of print, who knows? So I'd much rather just make the copy and know that I can work without problem on the copy without having to cut into the real one. So it's just kind of what I do. I know it's not for everyone, and I know it takes a little bit longer, but to be quite honest, especially as I move on to the vintage pattern, I just want to make sure that the original is kept intact, that if I ever need to go back to it, I have no problem doing that, and I don't have to keep spending money just willy-nilly for no reason. So anyway, got this guy set up, and now we're going to be working on the vintage pattern. So now I'm going to be showing you guys how to trace a real vintage pattern. So I'm going to be tracing this Vogue 5874 from the 40s. I bought this a while ago, so I've actually never traced this particular one off, so you guys are going to be seeing it for the first time as well. So I went ahead and carefully removed the pieces that I was going to trace. Thankfully, once you trace them onto your regular pattern paper, at that point those will be your permanent main copies. These guys can get put away. You won't have to mess with them or touch them because they're very delicate. I mean, at this point these are 80 years old, so you want to make sure to try and keep them as pristine as possible. So the first thing you want to do before you even get started is go ahead and take your phone or your digital camera and snap pictures of the whole instruction sheet, just so that you don't have to reference this guy again. So I'm going to go ahead and put that aside, and then you want to carefully unfold these guys. And so as you can see on here, you have a lot of dots, you got some notches and stuff. There's no markings on there except for this perforation that says, on this one it says hood, because it's going to be the hood of a garment. So you're going to have to copy all of these ones onto your pattern paper. So the first things first is we're going to go ahead and press it. So you want to make sure you have scrap of paper. This is a scrap of dot paper, but you can use a printer sheet or you know, just nothing with any color on there, because if the iron is just slightly too hot, it may leave an impression of the color on your pattern piece, and you don't want that. So we're going to go to the iron and press this piece. So as I said earlier, just make sure that your iron is on the lowest setting possible, because now it's super imperative not to mess up your original pattern piece. So I'm gonna go, I already have the pattern piece face down here. I have my scrap piece of paper. So I'm gonna go ahead and carefully put it on top. Try and flatten it out with your hands. And then you wanna slowly go over it with the iron. Very, very carefully. Try not to keep the iron in the same place, just because you don't want to mess up the pattern piece. So I went ahead and pressed a little bit there, and I can already see that it's working. And I'm going to move this guy around. So you're obviously not going to be able to get all the wrinkles out of the paper, especially if it's been folded for years. So you just want to make it as flat as possible so that it's easy to trace. And this one here, you're going to be tracing it a little bit differently than the versions that we did previously. So I think that's good. So you can see there, it's pretty flat, but you're still going to see all the original creases, which is fine. When we put it away, we're actually going to be using those creases to fold it back up like it was before. So I've already gone ahead and cut out my piece of dot paper. You know, you grab whatever paper you have. I've already pressed it flat. So this pattern piece we're going to treat a little bit differently than the ones that we've traced previously. So we're actually going to put the pattern piece on top of the paper. And I'm going to go ahead and flatten that out. From here I'm going to take my pattern weights and place them all over the place. If you're using something other than pattern weights, say you don't have pattern weights and you're using jars, or you're using scissors, or you're using a ruler to kind of flatten it out, just make sure that the bottom surface of it is as clean as possible so you don't leave any markings on your original pattern. And also just make sure that it's not going to leave any weird perforations in there, because it's going to be a mess. So just make sure to take care with that. Now we're not going to be using these guys right away. We're going to use these later, but the first thing we're going to do is actually take our pencil and we're going to go ahead and trace out the little line, or I'm sorry, the little dots that are in this original pattern piece. And then we're actually going to trace around the pattern piece, not just in one straight line, but we're going to do it in dots about 1 inch apart from one another. Now the reason being is if you try and just willy-nilly trace it, it's not going to turn out well. You just want to avoid that altogether. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys specifically how I'm going to do all of this, and then we're going to pull out our rulers after the end. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to trace off all the dots. So I'm going to go ahead and just I'm not putting my hand on there. So you want to minimize the oil contact of your hands on the pattern piece. So I'm going to go ahead and just continue to put in my little dots here. So I'm just double checking that I don't miss any of these dots, because these will all be important later. Oh, I got one down here. Cool. So the next thing you want to do is you're going to be tracing the pattern piece, but as I said, you're not going to do full lines. So instead what you're going to do is do little 1-inch markings, or about 1 inch. Doesn't have to be exact, but you're essentially just tracing around it loosely, just with little pinpricks, almost like a connect the dots sort of thing. This is just going to make it easier when you pull out your rulers later. So this guy on the corners, just move your pattern piece kind of to the corner just so that it's flat against the paper. Alright, so now I've traced all the way around the pattern piece, but you're not done yet. So there's still a couple other things that we need to mark on this piece, including the notches, which are here. And then we also have to put in the grain line. So on most vintage patterns, they're going to have a perforation of the name of the pattern piece, and those are going to be in the direction of the grain line. So here I see that this is the top of the hood. So I'm going to go ahead and put my ruler on top of that, directly in the middle of the name. And instead of just drawing a line like I might normally do, I'm going to go ahead and do it on the pattern paper itself, just so later I can connect that line. So I know that that's going to be the grain line. And then here I have my notches. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those again on the pattern paper, not on the original pattern. Because essentially all you're going to do is just extend that line later on. And here's the second one. I'm missing one. I can't tell if that's a tear or not on the paper, but I'm just going to put it in anyway, just in case. Cool. So at this point, you have your pattern piece traced off, almost completed. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the original. Cool. So right now, your trace paper doesn't look like anything except for some random marks and a few random dots. So I'm going to go ahead and at this point I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to start connecting the dots for all those dots that you drew earlier. Now if you expect needing that it might be a little bit complicated to see what's going on, if you need to put in more dots, do that. I personally find that 1 inch apart is fine for me, but if you need to put them in ½ an inch apart, that's totally cool. Or if you need to put them in different colors, that's okay as well. Now, if you're confused at all while you're lining everything up, if something doesn't look like it makes sense, that's where you can pull out, again, your original pattern piece before you put it away, just to confirm that everything is lining up like it's supposed to. So there's still some little areas where it's not perfect, but I'm going to go ahead and just compare how it looks against the original pattern piece. All right, that looks pretty good, that looks pretty good. Cool, not bad. So, cool. So now that we know that our outline is fine, I'm going to go ahead and extend in the notches and the grain line. So, go ahead and put these in here. You can kind of see my style of doing all my notches. I prefer long notches so I know I don't miss them when I'm cutting everything out. All right, so I've got here my grain line. Cool. So looks pretty good. Now you do have these kind of dots that are going to be used as guides later on. I personally am just going to do them with a highlighter. You can use a colored pencil if you want. You can do a circle around them. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave those marks. Now it looks like some of these are actually just sewing lines, because these ones I'm doing right now look like they fall on the seam allowance. So that just probably just tells you how much of a seam allowance it is. Yeah, it's about 5/8, so that makes sense. And then I have my additional markings. Cool. So now at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and put in gotta double check the number, but I'm gonna just put hood cut to self. Cool, and we're good to go. There's your pattern piece. So I hope you found this video useful if you're tracing your PDF patterns or your regular commercial patterns or your vintage patterns. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer them. If you want to go on and tell me why you don't like tracing patterns, I'm totally happy to have that conversation with you. If you like this video, give it the thumbs up, and please subscribe. It definitely means a lot, and I would love to hear any feedback you guys have about future videos. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one.